documents. In this faceless era, we have to draft in a meticulous way so that the assessing officer can come to know what exactly we mean to say. And for this, today we had a learned speaker, CA Bharat Popat sir. He is from Ahmedabad. I request CA Prabhavati to kindly give the brief introduction of this. Over to you,
Thank you,
Prabhavati.
Amish. Thank you, Amish, uh, for giving me this opportunity to introduce our today's speaker, CA Bharat R. Popat at Andheri Osivara Study Circle. Bharat sir, being the senior most partner of BR Popat and Company, started his practice originally in Bhavnagar in the year 1984 and has been managing the organization ever since. Despite being shifted from Bhavnagar to Ahmedabad in 2008, when his Ahmedabad office was established, he visits Bhavnagar as and when the need arises. He has inter area specialized in appellate side of the income tax practice and is primarily handling the litigation side at various levels right up to the tribunal. He has he also deals in cases at the level of Income Tax Settlement Commission. He has also represented hundreds of clients in search survey cases as well as in the consequential inquiries and resultant scrutiny assessment. Furthermore, he enjoys acting as an advisor to the one who needs his expert opinion on different issues, namely when Benami law, international taxation, etc.
Your voice is not coming, Prabhavati.
Actually,
Prabhavati?
no, network issue is there, bandwidth issue, sir.
Yes, yes, sir. Bandwidth issues there. Prabhavati's voice is not coming, Amish.
Mhm. Fine, I will introduce the sir. Bharat Popat sir, being the
मेरी आवाज आ रही है सबको?
हाँ सर, आपकी आवाज आ रही है. अमीश, आपकी भी आवाज नहीं आ रही. Amish,
and has
your voice
been
is also
managing the
cracking.
organizations ever since.
Amish, your voice is also cracking. अमीश,
अभी आ रही है?
हाँ, नहीं एक्चुअली रुक के आ रही है. अमीश, your voice is also cracking.
Then start the
There.
Let's start. Hello.
Amish.
हेलो दीपक.
हाँ अमीश.
अभी तू इंट्रोडक्शन स्टार्ट कर देना, मेरा भी बैंडविड्थ का प्रॉब्लम है.
Okay, just a sec.
मैं नेट चेंज कर रहा हूँ मेरा.
Okay.
काफी कुछ तो बोल दिया था ना
दीपक. हाँ, इंट्रोडक्शन की जरूरत
Sorry
नहीं है.
members, due to some technical issues we are facing, so but my net is proper. So, brief introduction of Bharat ji. So Bharat ji, being the senior most partner, he started his practice originally in Bhavnagar in the year 1984 and has been managing the organization ever since. And despite having shifted his base from Bhavnagar to Ahmedabad in 2008, when our Ahmedabad office was established, he visits the Bhavnagar branch as and when the need arises. He has inter-area specialized in appellate side of the income tax practice and is primarily handling the litigation side at various levels right up to the tribunal. He also deals in cases at the level of Income Tax Settlement Commission. He has also represented hundreds of clients in search and survey cases as well as in the consequential inquiries and resultant scrutiny assessments. So furthermore, he enjoys acting as an advisor to the ones who need his expert opinion on the different issues like Benami law, international taxation, etc. He has also mastered the art of drafting various legal and semi-legal documents like contracts, then MOAs, then testamentary declarations, partnership and LLP deeds. He is also fond of academic activities and thus takes lectures on subjects of professional interest from time to time. On the personal front, he is an avid reader and a travel lover, and he has traveled 39 countries across the globe. So, my dear members, we are very fortunate to have Bharatji today on our platform, and thank you, sir, for coming and for sharing your knowledge and your deliberation, sir. And
Thank you.
I guess the technical problem has solved now. So, sir, I would now so now I would now hand over to you, sir, Bharatji, for your
Okay. Thank you, Amish. Thank you, Deepak, for a very detailed introduction. I'll straight away start with my presentation. Can you see the slide?
No, sir.
No, sir.
No, sir.
No?
No, no.
Okay, just a minute. Can I do one thing? This is just the figures I obtained from Google on National Judicial Data Grid. As you can see, number of pending cases in various judiciary, 3.79 crore. ये पिछले साल के figures थे. Current year's pending figures in various courts is crossing 4 crore cases. This is the reason why drafting has become very important for all of us, because there is a civil litigation, there is tax litigation, and most of the litigations arise out of bad drafting made by people. So with this particular background, I'm just trying to limit myself to primarily income tax litigation or drafting in connection with income tax and little bit of drafting in connection with various contracts. Types of deeds and documents a practicing chartered accountant may be required to draft or deed. I'm not very aware as to the members are practicing in which part of the litigation or assessment, but I presume that most of the members listening to this speech would be doing practice in attesting, the audit and assessment, and maybe at CIT appeal level. So if we think of the gamut of services we render to our clients, we would be required to file written submissions before various authorities, either in assessment or in appeal, or we would be responding to summons and notices. Friends, we all know that many of our clients keep receiving summons, and wherever summons are issued, the assessing officer or the investigation officer who may have issued the summons would be expecting certain details to be furnished, and that has to be furnished in such a way that the client's interest is not adversely affected. Then there can be a case of drafting of commercial contracts or deeds or memorandum of agreements or will or testamentary declaration and codicil and loan applications. I would be just touching upon some of the issues arising out of these draftings, what to do and what not to do. The first thing, why drafting has become all the more important in these days. It is because there is an increasing shift from oral arguments to written submission with documentary evidences. Friends, you must be knowing that on this 1st of February 2021, when Nirmala Sitharaman declared that even the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal will become faceless. So maybe a couple of months down the line, or maybe 1 year down the line, we don't have to go to the courtroom in the tribunal and argue the case. Because if it becomes faceless, I cannot see who is sitting on the other side of the table or on the dais. and probably they would also not be knowing as to who is making the arguments. So for all probability, even in the tribunal proceedings, we would be required to file the drafted documents, that is the written submission, the gist of arguments, the documentary evidences, etc. Even if that is not done, or that is done belatedly, that particular thing has already come into being insofar as the assessments are concerned, insofar as the first appeals are concerned. As we all know, practically all the assessments except say in Central Circle or in international taxation, every single assessment is faceless. And even in Central Circle, whenever faceless assessment is not being carried out, we are expected to upload the written submissions rather than appearing before the assessing officer and arguing the case orally, which was the case a couple of years back, which was a normal case a couple of years back. So in this particular situation, we had two limbs of conveying what we wanted to convey. If you think of a situation a couple of years back, we used to argue the case in two ways. We would be carrying a written submission and a paper book or a file, which we would be submitting to the assessing officer. He would say, "Ke bolo, aapko kya kehna hai?" And we would also be supplementing that written submission by our oral argument. And friends, you know that in most of the cases, the assessing officers or the CIT appeal were taking decisions primarily on the basis of the oral arguments, while only cursorily going through the paper book or the content of the paper book we may have filed. Because in many of the cases, it so happens that the paper book we may file may be running into, say, 300 pages, and the assessing officer or CIT appeal would be dealing with hundreds of assessments or appeals. So he may not have sufficient time to go through each of the 300 pages we may have filed. So he would just ask us that what are the relevant points. He would note down the relevant points. Whenever we point out that, sir, see, this particular document is available on page number 37, this explanation is available on page number 3 of my paper book or written submission, he would just note down that, and on the basis of that, he would take his own decision. If it comes to arguing in a tribunal, in many of the cases,
Okay, sir, we are not able to hear your voice. Bharatji?
Is
Not able
now
to hear your
gone. It
voice.
is gone.
Bharatji?
Submission or proper drafting is encouraged. Yeah, hello? Am I audible?
Ah, sir, you are
Hello?
audible now, sir. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So with the faceless era, we are required to improve upon our drafting. And if we can improve upon our drafting skill, one interesting development has taken place, especially for juniors and especially for chartered accountants. Whenever it comes to appearing before an authority in person, that person, the officer, would be driven by the stature of the person who is sitting against him. Suppose, like in Bombay's field, if Mr. Shivaram appears before CIT appeal, and if Amish appears before CIT appeal, it will have complete different approach on the part of the CIT appeal. Because when Mr. Shivaram appears, the CIT appeal would know that he is a very senior advocate, regularly appearing before the High Court of Bombay. So whenever Mr. Shivaram tells something to him, he would be more patient in listening to what Mr. Shivaram says. He may not be that patient when Amish is arguing, or when maybe I am arguing before the CIT appeal, because we are relatively junior in comparison to Mr. Shivram. But when it comes to appearing through faceless assessments or faceless appeal, nobody knows who has argued the written submission. Nobody knows who is the person behind the entire preparation. So a junior most chartered accountant and the senior most chartered accountant or a senior most advocate, they are placed at the same footing. If you are good at drafting, you are at par with Mr. Shivram, you are at par with Nani Palkhiwala also. So it's a very good opportunity for fresh chartered accountants. If they can develop the art of drafting, they can handle very complicated cases in a best possible way without unnecessarily affecting the psyche of the officer who may be sitting on the other side of the screen. So that has to be taken care of, and we have to try to see that we can improve upon our skill of drafting. What are the basics of good drafting? The first and foremost basic thing is to identify the purpose of drafting and the skill level of the person who are going to read and interpret the same. Friends, when I am drafting a document which is to be read by an income tax officer or assessing officer for that matter, I should be knowing that the assessing officer at the most would be of the level of additional or joint commissioner of income tax. Most of the time, he would be either an income tax officer or a deputy or assistant commissioner. But when I'm drafting it for appellate authority, I should be knowing that the person reading this would be a commissioner of appeal, a substantially senior person. And when I'm drafting something for tribunal, I should be knowing that the person going to read is a member of the ITAT, which is the highest fact-finding authority in the tax litigation. So first you just identify as to who is the reader of the document being drafted by you, and you have to draft it accordingly, because you are drafting it in such a way that the person reading it should understand it in a very simplistic way. Second is to ensure that there is ease of understanding on the part of the reader. So that has to be taken due care of, because I have seen that in many of the cases, the assessing officers are not very good at English. They do not understand the language in a very proper way, especially the income tax officers who may have been promoted from the post of inspector. They may not be very good at English. They will, most of the time, they'll be very poor at understanding the provisions of law and extremely poor in interpretation of the judgments delivered by the High Courts or Supreme Court or the tribunal. So whenever you are drafting something, you must understand that they should appreciate what you are trying to say so that the meaning of your drafting is properly conveyed. What can be done for this? So it may be a good idea to give the background first before dealing with the issue proper. This is my practice, and that has always helped me in most of the cases. Before jumping into the main thing, I always try to give a small background of the entire issue and then start dealing with the issues proper. Suppose the assessing officer has called for some details. In that case, I would first give my background. I would say I'm a corporate entity regularly assessed to tax, VDA PAN number so-and-so, so-and-so. I'm engaged in so-and-so business. These are the peculiarities of the business. And after giving peculiarities of the business and the background, I would go to the questionnaire so as to deal with the individual issues that may have been raised by him in 142(1) notice. So that should always be a good way of starting the drafting, because like I am from Ahmedabad, I have my office in Bhavnagar, and Bhavnagar is the hub of shipbreaking activity. Now friends, up till now, whenever we used to appear before the assessing officer in Bhavnagar, the assessing officer sitting in Bhavnagar would have some idea about shipbreaking. He would have visited Alang shipbreaking yard. He would have known about what shipbreaking industry is all about. But like in faceless era, if I am dealing with assessment of a shipbreaking client, if I do not clarify anything about the shipbreaking business, and if my faceless assessment goes to the assessing officer sitting somewhere in, say, Lucknow, then in Lucknow, he may not even have heard of shipbreaking. He would not understand anything about that. Or say in salt industry or in diamond industries. Every single industry have got peculiarity of its own. Unless and until that is clarified at the very first stage, the assessing officer will not be in a position to appreciate the intricacies of that industry. Connected thing is command over the language. You must have proper command over the language because you must convey only with the help of your drafting and without supporting that with oral arguments. So I always suggest one particular thing which may be of some use to you. Forget that you are a chartered accountant and dealing with assessment or appeal. If you try to, suppose you have seen a particular movie, you have seen a particular movie and you want to tell the story of that movie to one of your friends. Okay, story of the movie is to be told to one of your friends who has not seen that movie. Try to write down in a very summarized way the story of that movie on a piece of paper. On a piece of paper. Hand over that piece of paper to your friend and then start telling that very story orally. The condition is whatever oral storytelling you do before your friend must be there somewhere written in the text. You cannot supplement your text by anything in addition to what is mentioned there. If you can achieve this, you have mastered the art of drafting. So we have to take care of one particular simple thing, that you don't have option of supplementing your text by oral arguments. And since that option is no longer available, everything has to be there in written text, and that too with brevity. Friends, when I did my chartered accountancy in 1982-83, we used to have one paper called OM. The seniors would immediately remember, Organization and Management. That used to be a paper in, I think, intermediate chartered accountancy course, inter-CA. And in that inter-CA course, in that OM paper, there used to be a instruction on the top of the paper book, on the top of the question paper, marks are reserved for brevity. Marks are reserved for brevity. That means that if you are brief in responding to various questions, if you do not fill up more and more of supplementaries, but if you are very precise, if you are brief but precise, then you will get higher marks. Friends, this is the art of drafting. Whenever you draft a document, you don't have to draft unnecessary things in it, but at the same time, you don't have to miss out any relevant things at the same time. So this is very essential while properly drafting the document. And cross-referencing. Cross-referencing, we always advise to do in two ways. First is always make it a point of having an index. Always have index. So whenever you upload something, you upload the written submission with documentary evidences along with an index. So index would say page number this to this is written submission, page number this to this are confirmation of the depositors, page number this to this is GP working or calculations, and so on and so forth. So there'll be index. This is one way of cross-referencing. And the other is on the margin of your written text, give cross-reference of the page numbers. Like suppose you say that I'm attaching here with the confirmation in respect of unsecured loans availed, then just put page numbers beside that, page numbers 31 to 43. So the assessing officer, while reading that, would clearly understand that if I want to see the confirmations, I have to turn to page number 31 to 43, and the confirmation would be lying there. So if you give cross-referencing, friends, if you give cross-referencing, most of the officers will not go to verify that. They would believe that since you are giving cross-references, everything is foolproof. They would believe in what is mentioned in the written submission. So even if some defects are there in the documents, they would go unnoticed if proper cross-referencing are made. Do focus both on facts and on law. While drafting a document, you have to give proper, appropriate thrust on the facts and on the law. Now, what is law, friends? Normally, when we start our practice, we rely exclusively on the provisions of the Act and at the most of the rules. So we may go through Income Tax Act, we may go through income tax rules, nothing beyond that. Like suppose 40A3 or suppose 40A1, 40A1A or any other 3613 or section 57. All these sections, whenever we are dealing with those sections, we would be just reading the section, and when we read a section, we tend to interpret the section the way we read it. But in most of the cases, you will find that the judiciary takes different view while interpreting those sections. So the view of the judiciary. So I can say that the law, कानून जो है, the law can be of two types. The law passed by the legislature, that is by the parliament. So when we say Income Tax Act is a law made by the legislature, but suppose Supreme Court says that this particular section is to be read down, this particular section is to be read down, or this particular section is to be interpreted in this particular way. In that case, the judgment of the judiciary will altogether make a different law. So interpretation of the statute is to be done by the judiciary, and whenever judiciary interprets a section in a way which is different than our own interpretation, or which is different than the interpretation of that section done by the assessing officer, it will be the judiciary's interpretation that will prevail. That has to be taken care of. So whenever you are drafting a document, whenever you are drafting a written submission to be filed before the AO or before CIT appeal or before anybody for that matter, you must go through not just the section, not just the law, not just the act, but also on the interpretation of this particular provision that may have been made by judiciary, maybe the territorial tribunal, territorial high court, or the Supreme Court, as the case may be. Friends, in this connection, if you are not aware, you must consider this Article 141. What is Article 141 of the Constitution? Article 141 says that the law declared by the Supreme Court shall be binding across India. The law declared by the Supreme Court shall be binding across India. So if you can try to find out a particular judgment of Supreme Court, okay, in that case, you can say that this is the law of the land. This is one part of the story. The other part of the story, there is a doctrine of judicial precedence. What is judicial precedence? Whenever, suppose, Supreme Court has ruled in the case of Kamalakshi Finance Corporation, there is a judgment of Supreme Court in the case of Kamalakshi Finance Corporation. It says that whenever in interpreting the provisions of law, a higher appellate authority has taken a particular view, in that case, that view is absolutely binding on everybody working below that judicial authority. So suppose say you are in Bombay and Bombay High Court has taken a view. Bombay High Court has taken a view in relation to interpretation of a particular section. And that view is in favor of the SSE. That view is in favor of the SSE. Now, maybe there may be a case that that particular judgment of the Bombay High Court is not accepted by the department, and the department has gone to Supreme Court. Supreme Court has already admitted the case, but has not granted any stay. In that situation, Kamalakshi Finance Corporation says that till that judgment of the Territorial High Court is reversed by the higher appellate forum, it is absolutely binding on the tribunal, it is absolutely binding on the CIT appeal, it is absolutely binding even on the assessing officer. So if you can quote a judgment of, say, Bombay ITAT or Bombay High Court in your case, maybe in assessment, maybe in appeal before CIT appeal, and simultaneously quote these two things. Article 141 of the Constitution of India, which says that the law of the Supreme Court is the law of the land. Then quote Kamalakshi Finance Corporation, that Supreme Court says that the judgment of the higher appellate authority is binding on the lower appellate authorities, even if that has been disputed by the department still against higher authority, higher appellate authority. So upon the judgment of Supreme Court in Kamalakshi Finance Corporation, the judgment of Bombay High Court or judgment of ITAT Bombay becomes the law of the land, or becomes at least binding to the CIT appeal or to the assessing officer. So taking a composite reading of all these provisions, you can improve upon your drafting. And if you can improve upon your drafting, in that case, you can definitely get a favorable judgment in assessment or in appeal, as the case may be. Then, friends, while making effective drafting, you need to properly interpret the provisions of law. And when you try to interpret the provisions of law, you have to consider two particular things. One is you have to keep updated, and you have to understand, you have to consider the law as it stood at the relevant point of time, not the amended law today. Because there are so many amendments being made year after year, and many of the amendments are prospective and not retrospective. So if you can consider the law which prevailed in, say, assessment year 1819, if you are dealing with assessment year 1890 now, you are not concerned with the amended law which has been implemented from assessment year 1920 or 2021. And you are also to consider the Hayden's mischief rule. I'm not going into greater detail in connection with Hayden's mischief rule, but whenever a law gets changed, we have to consider what was the mischief of the earlier law, and then to interpret the amended law. That is Hayden's mischief rule. So while drafting, we have to take care of this also. To deal with issues which the revenue is not authorized to raise or ask for. But this is very important thing, especially while dealing with summons. You must be knowing that summons are being issued under section 131 of the Act. And if you have gone through the standardized format of the summon, which is being issued by the assessing officers or by the investigation wing, the heading says summons to SSE / witness. The summon can be a summon to SSE or summon to a witness. And that summons is being issued. Most of the time, summons are being issued to the witnesses, especially by the investigation wing. Now, suppose a summon is issued to you. Suppose, hypothetically speaking, a summon is issued under 131 to a witness, calling for various details. Then you need to understand what are the powers and obligations on either side of the case, either side of the table. Friends, if you read section 131, 131 specifically says that while summoning a witness, the assessing officer shall have the same powers which are vested in a magistrate, in a court, under the Code of Civil Procedure. Now, if you go to Code of Civil Procedure, you will find that Code of Civil Procedure says under Chapter 16, Order 16, it says that assessing officer or investigation officer cannot issue a summon to a witness if the distance between the place of residence of that witness and the place of office of the assessing officer or the investigation officer is of more than 500 kilometers. Means what? Like you're sitting in Bombay, and if your client receives a summons as a witness from an assessing officer sitting in Jaipur or even Ahmedabad for that matter, just Google it, check the distance. What is the distance between Ahmedabad and Bombay? If you check it, you will find that it is exceeding 500 kilometers. It is roughly 524 kilometers. Okay. So the assessing officer or the investigation officer sitting in, say, Ahmedabad cannot issue a summon to you as witness if you are sitting in Bombay. With the only exception, if he has to issue a summon to a person sitting in Bombay and calling the attendance of that person in Ahmedabad, he has to send the returned air tickets. साथ में उसको एयर इंडिया की टिकट डालनी पड़ेगी, देनी पड़ेगी. He'll have to make arrangement for all expenses of that person concerned. Unless and until that is done, he cannot issue a summon to the witness if the distance is more than 500 kilometers. There are so many other things mentioned in the CPC, Civil Procedure Code, friends. But what I suggest is that whenever you receive a summon and whenever you have to respond to a summon like this, you must be very aware of what are the provisions of Section 131, what are the provisions of Order 16 of the Code of Civil Procedure, what are your rights and the rights of the assessing officer. You can always politely say that, sir, the distance is more than 500 kilometers. You cannot call me. But having called me, anyway, I'm not attending in person, but I'm filing with the relevant documents. That you can always do it. But whenever you think that the officer is crossing his limits, assessment, if you go through Section 142, you will find that he can call for the comparative results of last 3 years. So if he's assessing your case for, say, assessment in 18-19, he can call for your profitability details for 17-18, 16-17, and 15-16. But if he says, can you give me data for last 10 years, then it is not relevant. You can politely say that, sir, this is not within your powers. You cannot call for all these details. And you can very politely say no to what he is calling for. So there are so many details, so many things. Like similarly, I mentioned in the slide, calling for personal and confidential documents of the cash creditors in certain circumstances. He says, I have taken unsecured loan of, say, 20 lakhs of rupees from X. I am filing confirmation. Confirmation is a very self-speaking one. It contains the name and address of the person. The cash creditor is a corporate entity. The cash creditor is given me by check. He is having PAN number. I've given the PAN number also. And then he says, no, you just give me acknowledgement in respect of the return of income he may have furnished. You give me copy of the bank statement of the cash creditor. If he calls for all these details, there are judgments of high courts stating that if you can say that, sir, these are the confidential documents of the cash creditors, and cash creditors would have apprehension in parting these documents with me. So I have filed a confirmation. The confirmation contains the PAN number of the cash creditor. Confirmation contains the address of the cash creditor. If you are not comfortable with this, you can directly get in touch with either the cash creditor by issuing a summon under 131 or by calling for details under 133(6), or you can directly get in touch with your counterpart who may be the assessing officer of that person concerned. So if you can rely on such high court judgments and say that, sir, what you are called for is not warranted, I am not liable to furnish, or I am not in a position to obtain these documents from the cash creditors. So you are requested to obtain these documents from direct sources without burdening me with the additional liability of this. In that case, if you are given this type of written submission, for all probability, he will not ask for anything further beyond what you may have filed. So, but you must be very sure about this. You must be very specific about this, that I rely on this particular High Court judgment, which is binding. And since it is a confidential document, I am not in a position to obtain that from the person concerned. You are requested directly to get it. In that case, you can definitely escape your responsibility of filing such documents. One more thing is about bar against filing additional evidences. And if you must all be knowing, if you go through Rule 46A of the income tax rules or Rule 29 of the income tax appellate tribunal rules, both these rules say that whenever CIT appeal or the tribunal are hearing a particular appeal, you cannot file any additional evidences. This means that even if the assessing officer is not calling for certain details while framing the assessment order, but if you think that some documents are very relevant, make it a point of filing those documents. Because if some high-pitched additions are made by the assessing officer, suppose, let me give you a practical illustration. I had a case with me. That particular company was engaged in the business of manufacturing biofuel. Okay, the company engaged in the business of manufacturing of biofuel. And the manufacturing biofuel is eligible for 100% tax exemption, tax deduction, I think under section 80 JJ or something, for 5 full years. Now the assessing officer at the stage of assessment was of the view that I have not satisfied all the terms and conditions of biofuel requirements or section 80 JJA. So he wanted to disallow 80 JJA deduction. He issued a notice to the assessee that since these conditions have not been satisfied, I propose to disallow your entire deduction. Suppose that company has gross total income of say 5 crores of rupees and the entire 5 crore is claimed as deduction under section 80 JJA. So total income is nil, GTI is 5 crore. GTI is 5 crore. Okay. Now the assessing officer says that I am disallowing you deduction of 80 JJA. So I am assessing you at 5 crore of rupees. Now friends, if the entire assessment proceedings is revolving only upon section 80 JJ, nothing beyond that, obviously the assessing officer would not have asked anything beyond the interpretation of that section. How did I earn a profit of 5 crore of rupees? If I do not file anything in connection with this, that what did I manufacture, to whom I sold, from which source did I obtain the biofuel or that raw material? If I do not file any of these documents, and if the matter goes to the tribunal at the end of the day, tribunal takes an adverse view. In that case, if I have not filed anything in connection with the factual merits of the case, and I have dealt only with the legal provisions of the section, the tribunal will be forced to set aside the matter to the assessing officer rather than allowing my appeal. So in order to see that we are not required to file additional evidences either before CIT appeal or before the tribunal, we are required to ensure that even if not specifically called for, we file every single relevant document beforehand, so that in an unforeseen situation of there being an appeal on account of certain additions made, or in an unforeseen situation of there being some audit objection raised by AG team. Friends, you must be knowing in this budget also now it says that if AG audit has raised an objection, a final objection, that would be a sufficient ground for reopening the assessment. So now from next year onwards, for reopening the assessment, mere objection of the audit team is sufficient, and there is no requirement that assessing officer has reason to believe as to income having escaped assessment. So now that particular thing, section 147, as it stands today, if you read the budget, you will find that 147 of today and 147 of 1st April 2021, they are completely different sections. Same section, but now it is completely being replaced by a new section. So always make it a point that you draft your document in such a way that whatever you think is relevant is submitted beforehand, so that you are not facing any situation whereby the case can be reopened on the basis of audit objection, etc. This I can skip for want of time, what constitutes and what does not constitute additional evidence, because I mean, if you rely on a judgment, it does not constitute a additional evidence. So that is the simple thing. I'm just keeping that. Drafting of written submissions to be filed with the AO and CIT appeal is also, I think I have already covered, so I'm just keeping this. Drafting while responding to summons and show cause notice is also, I have already discussed part of that. The last thing is relevant. Let me take that. The last bullet. Implications of section 115 BBE and 271 AAD. What is BBE? BBE is taxing the deemed income at a higher rate of higher effective rate of 78%, 60 plus 15 plus 3. So whenever certain additions are being made under section 68 or 69 or 69A, B, C, etc., that will trigger a couple of things. That will trigger taxation of that income at 78%. That is number one. That will also trigger that you cannot claim set off or deduction of anything against that deemed income. So even if there is a loss in the return of income, that deemed income will be liable for taxation at 78%. So 115 BBE is a very tricky section. While drafting the submission in the assessment proceedings, suppose you are confronted with a situation that certain additions are inevitable. Certain additions, let me take a simple illustration. In your case, you are a manufacturing unit, and in that particular industry you are working in, or your SSC is working, your client is working in, the normal weight loss is say 10%. But your SSC, your client, has disclosed excessive weight loss of say 25%. This is one part of the factual aspect. Excessive shortage is claimed, and the assessing officer is disputing that. And the other part, the other factual, am I audible? Hello? Am I audible? हेलो, सुनाई देता है मेरी आवाज?
हेलो,
मेरी आवाज आ रही है? मेरी आवाज?
हाँ, यस सर, आ रही है सर. यस सर, यस.
ओके, आई थॉट के आवाज मेरी
नहीं, आ रही सर, प्रॉपर.
ओके, थैंक यू. Okay, so let us consider two aspects. One is मेरी shortage is excessive है, and assessing officer has challenged it that in your industry the shortage should not exceed 10%. Even in your case, in all earlier years, the shortage was in the range of 8 to 10%, and this year the shortage is 25%. This is one part of the factual defect in your case, and the other part is you have accepted unsecured loans from various parties, and you are not in a position to prove identity, creditworthiness, and genuineness, or at least one of the three conditions. So, assessing officer has issued you a show cause notice. AO has issued you a show cause notice proposing two additions. Addition number 1, why should I not restrict your shortage at 10%? Why should I not restrict your shortage at 10%, which translates into a difference of 15% of shortage? Hello, mute कर देंगे सब लोग? हाँ. Okay. So show cause 1 is that I propose to restrict your shortage at 10% and make appropriate addition with reference to the excessive shortage of 15% disclosed by you in the audited annual accounts. And part 2 of the show cause notice is that you have accepted unsecured loans from A, B, C, D, E, and all these unsecured loans are given by the respective cash creditors depositing cash in their banking statement and issuing checks there against. So he would say that looking to the totality of the situation, these cash credits appear to be lacking the genuineness of the transactions. So I propose to invoke section 68 for making appropriate addition, which will be taxed under 115 BBE. Now, if you receive a show cause notice for these two issues, you know you cannot escape both these additions fully. One addition is definitely going to stay. In that case, your art of drafting will help you a lot. Because if you can try to link it without prejudice, without admitting, do not admit, do not say that I accept my having excessively shown shortage, but you say that even if there is a merit in what you say, in that case, if I showed excessive shortage, that means that I had a 15% of stock available with me for sale out of books. If I had 15% of the stock available for sale out of books, obviously I had availability of cash to the extent of that. And if I utilize that cash for converting that into unsecured loan by accepting unsecured loan from A, B, C, D, even if those unsecured loans are treated as my own income, they get telescoped against availability of fund in the form of 15% shortage. So if you can claim telescoping of these two things, probably you can avoid one of the two additions, that is number 1, and probably you can avoid invocation of section 115 BBE, because in that case, the addition to be made by the assessing officer will be that of unaccounted sale. So there is a definite source attached to their income. So that will be falling under the regular business income, not under section 68, nor under section 69. So you can avoid, or you can get the amount addition shifted from 78% taxation to maybe 30% taxation. And you can also avoid the duplication of addition. This can always be done. If not in assessment, definitely in appeal, that can be taken care of. So while drafting the return submissions, you need to take care of all these provisions of the law and you need to draft it accordingly. Similarly, section 271 AAD is in connection with penalty for wrong entries. If there is a wrong entry in the books of entry or missing entry in the books of account, there is 100% penalty, especially in GST fraud. This is going to be a very hard hitting thing. So while drafting something in assessment, you need to take care of this also. That assessing officer may not, like suppose there is a Hawala dealer carrying on GST billing activities, and his assessment is being carried out by the assessing officer. It is proved that he was only raising invoices. He has issued sales invoices to the extent of say 10 crore of rupees, and he has correspondingly shown purchases to the extent of 9 crore 90 lakhs of rupees. So the purchase, the profit element in that, or the GP element is that only 10 lakhs of rupees. But you are not concerned with paying tax on 10 lakhs of rupees. You are concerned with leviability of penalty in connection with 100 lakh, the entire amount of purchase and sale, because that will be triggered by 271AA(d). So while dealing with the assessment proceedings in such cases, you must think well in advance that my return submission may not trigger a huge addition in the assessment order. But penalty proceedings are independent of assessment proceedings. If you admit something in the return submission as to your having done billing activities, maybe he would accept your returned income at 10 lakhs of rupees GP or 5 lakhs of rupees net profit after giving deduction of the overhead expenses. But while passing the assessment order, he would issue a notice under section 274, read with section 271AA(d), that why I should not levy penalty in respect of your entire purchase, which is not purchase as admitted by you, and with reference to your entire sale, which is not sale as admitted by you. In that case, you will find it very difficult at a later stage to defend this particular penalty. So take extreme care while dealing with the original level of litigation or original level of assessment. Practical illustrations of drafting. Let us take some. This is a simple thing, but I already taken. We use the term assuming though not admitting about an allegation to be true. So always have an alternative argument by accepting certain allegations made by the assessing officer in your against you. Like in this earlier, as I told, that in 115BB thing, if the shortage is 25%, he says shortage is not 10, has to be 10%. Then while dealing with section 68, you say that all cash creditors are genuine, but assuming though not admitting about that not being genuine, even in that case, no separate addition under section 68 is warranted in view of your proposal of subjecting 15% shortage as addition to my returned business income. So that would be assuming though not admitting an allegation to be true argument. Always do this while dealing with a situation like this. Whenever you are encountering an alternate two additions, this argument will go a long way in your favor. Then to consider the consequences while drafting and uploading any text or document before any authority. While doing this, try to minimize the loss. Friends, there cannot be a situation where you always win in assessment or in appeal, because if you are a junior, you are not prone to appear before CIT appeal or tribunal. You would have, I mean, just consider the percentage of success and percentage of failure. Now, if you have a client and you are auditing the accounts of the client, what are the chances that you will ultimately audit and give the audit report? 100%. If you are auditing the accounts of the auditee, 100% chances are there that you will be completing the assignment, you will be signing the balance sheet, you will be handing over the audit report to him, you will be charging your fees. When it comes to assessment, if it's a scrutiny assessment, what are the chances? What percentage are the chances that your assessment will be accepted at your returned income? Maybe you would say 90%. That if you make proper return submissions, only 10% of the cases will be subjected to some additions, but 90% of the cases there won't be any addition, and the return income will be accepted as such. So chances of 10% failure. Then if you go to, in those 10% cases, if you go to CIT appeal, for the 10% addition, 10% cases in which additions are made, the chances of your winning in appeal probably will get reduced to maybe 70%, because case may not be very strong and you may lose the case in 30% of the cases. So risk is increased from 10% to 30%. If you go to tribunal after losing your case in CIT appeal, for all probability, tribunal, you may not expect more than 50% chance of winning the case if you are lost in assessing officer level, if you are lost in CIT appeal. So the percentage of risk increases with every increase in the level, and that has to be taken due care of. So whenever you are dealing with a case, maybe at the level of assessing officer, maybe at any other level, you must understand that minimizing the risk, minimizing the loss is of paramount importance. Eliminating the loss or eliminating the risk of addition fully may not be possible always. So in that situation, try to understand. These are the sections I have just referred to in my slide. Section 270 capital A and 270 capital AA. What are these sections? Now that 271(1)(c) has gone, now the penalty is being levied under section 270 capital A. But it says that if it is an underreporting of income per se, underreporting income per se means some estimation additions are made, and if you just pay up the tax within a period of 30 days time from the date of receiving assessment order, and if you file form number 68, in that case, the assessing officer himself has got power of granting complete immunity from levy of penalty under section 270 AA. So friends, just go through 270A and 270 AA. If assessing officer is bent upon to make addition of something, try to see that that addition is being made in such a way that it does not trigger deeming fiction, that is number one. It does not trigger invocation of underreporting of income as a result of misreporting. If it is underreporting per se, in that case, you can escape the penalty in full even after the same has been subjected to addition. So you make a drafting in such a way that the penalty can be reduced this way. Then drafting, now we slightly shift our focus to drafting of contracts. Whenever drafting of contracts, you need to consider a couple of things. I would be dealing with some technical things in this. One is, let me first deal with section 55. Have you gone through Indian Contract Act? Section 55 of the Indian Contract Act, let me first go through that. This is verbatim the section I have reproduced here. That is why it looks lengthy. Section 55 of the Indian Contract Act says, I'm just reading the highlighted, underlined portion. It says that if a party to the contract, if certain things are mentioned as essence of the contract, if certain things are mentioned as essence of the contract in the contract itself, and if that essence of the contract has not been met with by the party, the other party has got option of getting that contract void. So it becomes voidable at the option of the promisee. Voidable at the option of the promisee if the intention of the parties was that time should be the essence of the contract. Take a very simple illustration. Suppose I am taking a particular apartment on rent. I am taking a particular apartment on rent for a period of 1 month. I enter into a contract on this day, on 13th of March, with the landlord, and the landlord says that I'll be handing over the key of the apartment from 1st of April. Okay, from 1st of April 2021 till 30th of April 2021, I'm taking that apartment on rent for 30 days period. Now, something happened and the landlord could not deliver me the keys of that apartment on 1st of April. He delivered me key on the 2nd of April. Okay, he delivered me the key on 2nd of April. I have paid the full rent in advance. I have paid the full rent in advance on 13th March itself for 1 full month. But he gave me the key on 2nd of April and not on 1st of April. Now, if the contract mentions that handing over the possession on 1st of April in the morning hours is the essence of the contract, then I can refuse to accept the key on 2nd of April and claim the refund of the entire amount that I may have paid as the rental or deposit. Okay, because that is the essence of the contract. If the contract is silent on to this, in that case, the landlord can always say that, okay, I delayed possession by 1 day. You give me back the possession the 1st of May rather than giving it on 30th of April. So I compensate you for that. Or alternatively, he can say that, okay, I will consider the rent only for 29 days and refund you the rent of 1 day, if it is not essence of the contract. So whenever you draft a contract, I come back to that. Whenever you draft a contract, make it a point that what is the essence of the contract and what is not the essence of the contract. Make it very specific in the contract. The drafted contract must mention that these are the conditions which are to be treated as the essence of the contract. So any violation, any failure in compliance of the same will result in the contract becoming voidable at the option of the other party. And if it is voidable, he can claim all remedies arising out of the same. So that is one thing we have to take care of, essence of the contract to be specifically provided for. Second is force majeure. Force majeure clause has come into limelight, especially in this COVID period, because I come across a couple of cases wherein even multinational companies who were the tenants of commercial premises, they just issued notices to the landlord that since there was a lockdown for 2 months in the month of April and May, I am not going to pay any rent for that period. They said we are invoking force majeure. So in order to see that this thing does not happen, because force majeure is a particular term which has got no specific definition anywhere. So whenever you draft a contract, make it a point of providing for force majeure and of appropriately defining that in the contract itself, that these conditions will only be covered in the force majeure and rest of the conditions will not get covered, so that any violation other than those violations will not be adversely hit by the force majeure clause. Then there has to be an arbitration clause. Whenever dispute, instead of knocking the doors of the High Court or the court, competent court, we can go to the arbitration under the arbitration law. Then defining the jurisdiction of the court in the drafting is very important. Suppose I am sitting in Ahmedabad, I enter into a contract with somebody sitting in Bombay, and that contract is in relation to a property which I am letting out, but situated in Hyderabad. So property is situated in Hyderabad. I am the landlord sitting in Ahmedabad, and somebody is a tenant sitting in Bombay. If there is a dispute, where will the jurisdiction lie? That has to be specified. Whether that will lie in the court of Ahmedabad, whether that will lie in the court of Hyderabad, or whether that will lie in the court of Mumbai. That has to be clarified. So all these small things go a very long way in reducing litigation to a very great extent. And if that can be done, if that is properly drafted, we can get a lot of litigations avoided, so that pendency of almost 4 crores of rupees in the courts of law, at least we would not be instrumental in increasing that pendency. a properly drafted document is there to incorporate all the terms and conditions that may be agreed upon or required to be agreed upon. So whenever you draft, these are the basic things to be considered. Then contracts bind only the parties. This is very important. Contracts bind only the parties. I have come across a case of a partnership firm. See, there is a partnership firm of, say, 2 persons, A and B. Okay, A and B are partners. Say chartered accountants or any other business for that matter. A and B are partners, and in the deed of partnership, it is mentioned that in case of death of any of the 2 partners, the firms shall not stand dissolved, and the legal heirs of the deceased will have to be taken as partner by the surviving partner. Suppose there is a clause like this: A and B are the partners, or say ABC are partners, ABCD are partners, and the deed says that in case of death of any of the partners, the firm shall not stand dissolved, and the legal heir of the deceased will have to be taken as partner with the same terms and conditions as that of the person having expired. Is this clause in the partnership deed binding in law? No. Friends, it is not binding in law. Even if partnership deed says so, the surviving partners can always say that we would not take the legal heir of the deceased as our partner. Suppose I am a partner with Amish, and a similar clause is made in the partnership deed. I am sharing, say, I being senior by age, my profit sharing is 70% and Amish's profit sharing is 30%. There is a deed providing that in case of death of either of the 2, the legal heir will have to be taken. Now, say my son is just 25 years old and he has just qualified as a chartered accountant, and I die. My son tells Amish that now I'm your partner and I'm your 70% partner. Amish would definitely say, Bhaiya, Bharat bhai tak to baat theek thi. He was my senior and I was paying him 70%, or we were sharing profit in 70-30 ratio. But you are just 25 years old. I cannot take you as 70% partner. Okay. So there are judgments even of Supreme Court saying that since the contract of partnership is a contract between the partners per se, they cannot bind a third party. They cannot bind a third party. Third party is not a party to that contract. So what to do? I always suggest that in such partnership deed, make it an alternative clause. Make it an alternative clause like goodwill clause, which I mentioned here in this bullet, last but one bullet. I would say, suppose there is a partnership of A, B, and C. I would say, I would mention in the deed of partnership that whenever if there is an unforeseen event of demise of any of the partners, the firm shall not stand dissolved, and the remaining partners, with or without any further partner to be incorporated, shall continue the business as a going concern. The deed would further provide that in such a situation, if any of the legal heir is willing to join as partner of this firm so as to take place of the deceased, and if the continuing partners are willing to take him as partner with or without modifications of the terms, he would be taken. But if either the legal heir of the deceased is not willing to join as partner, or if the continuing partners are not willing to take him as partner, as the case may be, in that case, the legal heirs will be entitled to get not just the amount that may be standing to the credit of the deceased, but also his appropriate share in the goodwill of the firm. So what will happen? There are 2 alternatives made in the partnership deed. There is an option: if everybody is willing, the legal heir will be taken as partner. If legal heir is taken as a partner, there is no question of payment of goodwill, because he is continuing to share the profits even after the demise of his father or elder. If he is not willing, or if the existing partners are not willing to take him as a partner, in that case, the continuing partners will have to quantify the goodwill and will have to pay share of goodwill to the legal heirs of the deceased, which would be the addition to the amount that may be standing to the credit of the deceased. So if you can make a provision like this, then the last bullet, I always make in all the partnership deeds we draft about the permissible remuneration payable to the working partners. As you all know, in order to claim deduction of the remuneration paid to the working partners, there has to be a enabling provision in the deed of partnership, that is number one, and remuneration has to be debited in the books of account. Now, suppose in a situation where there is a loss in the books of account of the partnership firm, and we thought that why to pay remuneration to the working partners, because if we pay remuneration to the working partner, even to the extent of 1,50,000, which is the maximum permissible in that case, partners individually may be paying tax at 30%. So they would take a call not to pay any remuneration to the working partners in view of there being loss, or in view of there not being any profit being at zero because of some deductions or because of whatever other reason. We can draft the partnership deed in such a way that in the event of any possible additions being made by the assessing officer, if you receive a show cause notice, without going into the merit of such show cause notice and without hampering the right of appealing against such proposals, the partnership firm will have every right of preparing supplementary set of books of account in connection with that particular year, of paying remuneration to the partners in respect of the disputed addition so being proposed, and to claim that as deduction. If you can put a clause like this in the deed of partnership, possibly in this type of situations, you can try to avoid certain tax liability. If you can make comparison of the tax liability of the partner vis-a-vis tax liability of the firm after that addition, this type of clause may help you in a given situation. Now I switch to probably the last part of this, drafting of wills. Any ambiguity in the will is likely to result in a lot of difficulties with there being no remedy. Let me take a simple illustration which I actually faced in one of my clients' case. There was a proprietor of business, a jeweler. There was a proprietor of business, a jeweler, having a office, a shop on a prime location with huge amount of stock of gold and diamond materials. He made a will. He had two sons, A and B. He made a will that after my death, my shop will go to A, all my other assets will go to B. My shop will go to A, all my other assets will go to B. And he died. After his death, that B went to A, and B said that I am removing the entire stock of gold and diamond from the shop. A said, no, as per will, I am entitled to the entire thing. You are entitled only to the residence, only to the personal belongings, the personal car, etc. Because the will says that the shop goes to A. B said, the will says the shop goes to you, not the stock lying in the shop. This was the actual dispute. And nobody knew what was the intention of the person who already passed away. So this will unnecessarily result into challenging the will before the court of law. And friends, as you all know, with pendency of 4 crore cases in the civil courts, any dispute challenging the will may take years and years together in getting that resolved. So whenever you draft a will, make it a point. You just try to sit down and ensure as to how to implement the provisions of the will in reality. Which asset will go to whom, and whether that is forthcoming from the drafting of the will itself or not. So will has to be drafted in a very proper way, very apt way. The other precautions we always advise are, one is always have executors in the will. What are the executors? If I make a will, it's quite possible at times that actual devolvement takes substantially longer period of time. Suppose a very rich man, he may have say 3-4 crores of bank FD, he may have mutual fund investments, huge mutual fund investments, he may have a couple of immovable properties which have been given on rent. So he is receiving income from rent, he is receiving income from interest, he is receiving income from dividend, he is receiving income from various other sources. So even after his death, till all these assets devolve upon the legatees, the income will continue pouring in. If the income continues pouring in, who will pay tax on that? Friends, you need to go through sections, the two relevant sections of the Income Tax Act. One is section 159. 159. 159 says that the income of the deceased from the beginning of the financial year till the date of his death. Suppose a person dies on 13th of March 2021, then whatever income he may have earned between the period from 1st April 2020 till 13th March 2021 will be his own income, and his legal heir will file the deceased's return of income under section 159. That is the normal return we file, but it will be filed under section 159. But suppose, what about the income from 14th March 2021 till 31st March 2021? Income from 14th March till 31st March 2021. Suppose that person, the bank interest is flowing in, the deposit has not been transferred to the legal heir till 31st of March, or maybe till even 1 year after that, the property's rent is coming, the property has not been transferred in the name of the legal heir, or even the identification of the legal heir is not there, or there are some disputes, and the dispute takes several years in resolving. So section 168, the other section is 168. It says that whenever a situation like this arises, that income of the deceased after his death, income of the deceased for the period post his death will be taxed in the hands of the executor. Will be taxed in the hands of the executor. And if there is just one executor, it will be driven by individual taxation. If there are more than one executors, it will be driven by AOP taxation. So if I make a will and I say that A, B, and C, 3 will be my joint executors, in that case, my post-death income till the underlying assets devolve upon my legal heirs will be subjected to AOP taxation. AOP taxation means it will be, for all practical purposes, taxed at the maximum marginal rate without there being any 250,000 exemption and 5% tax and 20% tax, etc. But if I say in the will that I want to have A, B, or C as my executors, I would say A, B, and C are the 3 persons who are very close to me, who are very close to all my family members. I am very sure that they all will take care of my family members even after I am gone. But I express my wish that one of these 3 will be made the executor, while the other 2 will only be helping him out. So I am expressly stating my will that only one of the 3 will be my executor, the remaining 2 will only be helping him out. So I will be in a position, or my legal heirs will be in a position to claim individual taxation qua executor till the assets get devolved upon the legal heirs. So they can claim 2,50,000 of exemption, they can claim 5% taxation initially, then 20% taxation, and so on and so forth. So that benefit will be available. So drafting of a will in a proper way may be a good tax planning device also. So you need to take care of this as a tax planning device also. Rules as to stamp paper, notarization, registration, written versus oral, etc. What are the rules? As we all know, no stamp paper is required, no notarization is required, no registration is mandatory. Will has to be written, it cannot be oral. Originally, there used to be oral will considered as valid, but after the Indian Succession Act, now there cannot be an oral will. Will has to be in writing, but the written will can be on a plain piece of paper, can be without notarization, but it is always advisable. It is always advisable that it is registered. If it is not registered, at least it is notarized. So while drafting the deed or drafting the will, please take care of all these things. One thing, very interesting thing, you may be knowing, you may not be knowing, is about probate. Let me just tell you, it is not, though not related directly with drafting, but it's a very interesting thing. As you all know, there are two succession laws to Hindus applicable in India. One is Hindu Succession Act and the other is Indian Succession Act. Whenever a Hindu dies interstate, that is, whenever a Hindu dies without making a valid will, he will be driven by Hindu Succession Act. And whenever Hindu Succession Act is applicable, he may be required to obtain succession certificate. Succession certificate. The alternative is, whenever he has made a will, then in that case, if the will is considered to be valid, in that case, he would be driven not by Hindu Succession Act, he would be driven by Indian Succession Act. And as per the Indian Succession Act, whenever a Hindu has made a will, probate is required. Mind well, this is very important. Probate is required only within the jurisdiction of 3 high courts in India. Which are three high courts? Any idea? Bombay High Court. So probably, I mean, you will require a probate if you have a local client in Bombay. Bombay High Court, Chennai High Court, and Calcutta High Court. So if the asset, if the underlying asset, or if the person is based or situated within the jurisdiction of these 3 high courts, Bombay, Chennai, and Calcutta, only in that case, the will is required to be probated. Will is required to be probated. But like I am sitting in Ahmedabad, if somebody has made a will in Ahmedabad, all his properties are situated in places other than these 3 states, West Bengal, Chennai, and Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. In that case, nobody can call for a probate for implementation of the wishes that may have been expressed in his will. So this probate law is required to be read in a greater detail while drafting the will. Because when you draft a will, when you advise a person in relation to drafting of the will, these are the technical issues which are of great importance. Drafting of will of a Muslim, this is another interesting thing. As you all may be knowing, a Muslim may by his will dispose of only up to 1/3 of his property, which is left after payment of funeral expenses and debts without the consent of his heirs. See, this is one thing. If I am a Mohammedan and I want to make my will, if I have got, say, properties and assets worth 10 crore of rupees and corresponding liabilities at, say, 1 crore of rupees, corresponding liability of 1 crore and assets worth 10 crore. So my net capital or my estate is my asset minus liability. Estate is 9 crore as per Muslim law. I can make my will only to the extent of 1/3. So I can make will only to the extent of 3 crore of my assets, nothing beyond that. This is one thing. So even if a Muslim has made a will, bequeathing everything to a particular son or daughter or wife or whatever, that will not have any binding force. This is one part while drafting a will of a Muslim. Because we as professional, whenever we are advising our Muslim client, we need to go through the Muslim law first. Unless you read the Muslim law, you cannot draft a will of a Muslim properly. And second bullet, it is even more interesting. I'm just reading that first. With respect to Shia Muslims, the bequest of the permissible 1/3 may be made either to an heir or to a non-heir. So if I am a Shia Muslim, I can say that 1/3 of my asset will go to my son or to my daughter or to my wife, as the case may be. I can make 1/3 of the will to anybody if the Muslim is a Shia Muslim. But if the Muslim is a Sunni Muslim, I think most of the Muslims in India would be Sunni Muslims, I believe. So if he's a Sunni Muslim, the 1/3 bequest may be made only in favor of a non-heir. See, this is very peculiar, without the consent of his heirs. If it is made to an heir, it is invalid unless consent of heirs is obtained after death of the testator, in which case it is valid. This is very interesting thing. Suppose a Muslim has got 4 sons and a wife. A Muslim male has got and he's a Sunni Muslim. Muslim has got 4 sons. A, B, C, D are 4 sons. And Mrs. X, he's X. So his wife is Mrs. X. So 5 members in his family. 5 members in his family. And he has got 10 crores of assets and 1 crore of liability. So net estate is 9 crore. So he can make a will of 3 crores of rupees. He made a will of 3 crores of rupees. If he says that my 3 crore of assets, by identifying the assets, that this particular asset which is worth 3 crore, I give that to, say, Mr. J, who is neither his son nor his wife. He's a complete stranger. Then that will is valid. He says that I give that 1/3 of the asset to a non-relative, non-heir, who is not the legal heir of the deceased. In that case, that 1/3 will shall be binding on all his legal heirs. But if he has made a will that my 1/3 of the asset in the form of so-and-so property will be devolved upon my wife, say, will be devolved upon my wife, or will be devolved upon my son A. In that case, if he's a Sunni Muslim, that particular will devolving upon the 3 crores of asset in the name of one of his legal heir will be valid if and only if, mind well, if and only if after his death, all his legal heirs, except in writing, give in writing that the will of my deceased father or my deceased husband is acceptable to me. Only in that case, even this 1/3 bequest will take place. Otherwise, that will be treated as absolutely null and void. This is Muslim law. One must understand this. So whenever you are drafting a will, friends, this is a very lucrative area, very social cause provoking area, because when I started my career in Bhavnagar, I had number of Muslim clients, and this Muslim law, when I talked to almost 30-40 of my Muslim clients, nobody was knowing about the Muslim law. Nobody knew about the Muslim law. And since they were not knowing about the Muslim law, they used to make the will, and that will would not have any sanctity, legal value. So while drafting the will, we need to be very cautious about the provisions of law. So you must have a complete detailed reading of Muslim law. You must have a detailed reading of Hindu law. You must have detailed reading of the succession law, the probate law, and then you must draft your document. Friends, with this, I close my presentation. If there are question answers, I would be glad to deal with that. In the last thanks slide, I have just put certain things which I have loved a lot. So if you just feel like reading or watching or considering something which I have mentioned here, are just the tips for you. Thank you very much, friends. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Amish, go ahead.
Any member, any queries we can discuss, sir is available. I think Bharat bhai, there is no queries. You had explained well.
I hope so. I hope so.
Just a moment. Yes, Deepak, you can continue. Tomorrow announcement also you can make.
Just a second. Amish, yes.
Sir, there is one query from CA Amin Keshwani, sir. What about the 2/3 in the case of Muslim?
What about?
The 2/3 in the case of Muslim law.
2/3, okay. I'll let you 5 minutes. Is it okay? Okay. See, Muslim law is predominantly based on the necessities of the persons who are left behind by the deceased. So they have given a layer of tables, like if a person dies, who will need the property of the male Muslim dying, we can say that widow, okay, widow, then widowed mother, so that they all fall under category 1. So like a male person, let me give an illustration. A male Muslim died, leaving behind him 4 legal heirs. 4 legal heirs. One is his mother, who is a widow. Father is dead already. So widowed mother. His own widow, because he died, so his wife, and 2 sons. And 2 sons. 2 sons, one son is minor son, the other is adult son. In that case, Muslim law says that for the 2/3 of the asset or the entire asset, if the will is not made, 1/6 each. 1/6 of the assets will go to the widow and the widowed mother. तो इसमें 9 करोड़ की जैसे एसेट बची है, 9 करोड़ का 1/6, तो that makes how much? 2/6. That is 1/3. So 9 करोड़ में से 3 करोड़ चला जाएगा, 1.5 करोड़ जाएगा उसकी मदर को, who is a widow, and 1.5 करोड़ चला जाएगा उसकी वाइफ को. Okay. बाकी बचा 6 करोड़. 6 करोड़ will devolve upon the second level. अब second level पे only minor child will be there. Second, क्योंकि adult child is at level 3, not at level 2. तो second level पे कुछ बचा, तो second level पे उसको 1/6 मिलेगा और उसके बाद third level पे जाएगा, and so on and so forth. वो हिसाब से नीचे नीचे उतरता जाएगा. Now take a situation that suppose the deceased had 3 widowed daughters. 3 widowed daughters. 3 बेटियां हैं, तीनों के हस्बैंड डेथ हो गई है. 2 wives. तो 2 बीवियां हुई, 3 बेटियां हैं और 1 विडो मदर है. तो टोटल फर्स्ट लेवल में कितने लोग आए? 6 लोग आए. 6 लोग आए तो 1/6 करके पूरा खत्म हो गया. तो बेटों को कुछ मिलेगा ही नहीं. The son will not get anything in that case. So लेवल 1 पे आपको डिवॉल्वमेंट करना है. कुछ बचता है तो लेवल 2 में जाएगा. लेवल 2 में कुछ बचता है तो लेवल 3 में जाता है. 3 में बचता है तो 4th में जाता है. And so on and so forth. और अगर टोटल पहले लेवल पे 6 से ज्यादा एंटाइटलमेंट है, अगर 8 लोग हैं, तो 1616 की बजाय 1818 करके पूरा खत्म कर देना है. Nothing will go to level 2. So this will be the way of devolvement in case of Muslims under the Muslim law. Am I clear?
Sir, so one more question is from Suresh Hegde ji.
Yeah.
Okay, so, sir, so probate is required with respect to assets in these 3 states only?
Only three states. Nowhere.
Okay. Any more questions from the members?
आप इंडियन सक्सेशन एक्ट पढ़ लेना. आई थिंक सेक्शन 56 या 57 है. Just Google Indian Succession Act and read that, and you will find this.
Okay, sir. Okay. So I guess, sir, the questions are over from the member side. So, so for the members, there is one announcement. So tomorrow there is a 40th meeting, and from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. And the meeting is on, and the topics for tomorrow's webinar is on caution to be taken in cash transactions. And to take this session, we are having a speaker from Jaipur, CA Ashok Kumar Jain. And the second session will be on taxation of an insight into the taxation of cooperative housing societies and issues involved in that. And this session will be taken right from South Kerala, from CS Sashan TT. So members are requested to participate in large numbers and take the benefit of learning.
One hand has been raised. Should we unmute her? Dwanisha.
Yes, fine enough, fine enough. You can unmute. Aditya, go ahead. I guess she's not able to hear. Okay. So, sir, finally, Bharat ji, your deliberation was fantastic. As
Thank you very much.
So, sir, as you rightly told, firstly, that this faceless era has brought the new chartered accountants at par with the old chartered accountants, sir, experienced chartered accountants.
Yeah.
And the present and the future practice of CS will largely be depend upon art of drafting of deeds and documents, sir. And you, sir, you have explained the entire sir concept in very detailed manner and with the examples and everything, sir. So, sir, on behalf of Andheri Oshiwara Study Circle, I, Deepak Madhecha, present you a hearty vote of thanks. And, sir,
Thank you.
And in future also, we look forward to hear from you in future, sir.
Thank you very much.
Say something. Amish?
Thank you, Bharat bhai.
Thank you. And I would congratulate you because I just listened that you are inviting speakers from all over India.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, right
That's
from
a very great achievement.
sir, right from Jammu Kashmir to